Number 1.
Authorities investigated 2 separate tips in the unsolved case of Josh Adams, who went missing in Jackson County 7 years ago, but neither tip provided an answer to the mystery. When deputies went to a home in Madison County on May 25 to check out a lead, they ended up arresting 3 people on drug charges, while another lead took officers to an abandoned farmhouse in Oglethorpe County, which also was a bad tip. When we went to Oglethorpe County last week, we put a camera down a well, and there was nothing in the well, Jackson County Sheriff Janice Mangum said Thursday. I think it's people involved in drugs who are talking, but we check out every tip we get, she said. Adams, 25, went missing on May 20, 2013. His car was found abandoned in a rural area outside Jefferson, but his wallet, identification and cell phone were inside the car, according to reports. Adams, who had earlier completed drug rehabilitation for an addiction, was never found, although there was a ground and air search in the area. A nearby pond was also drained. The family has offered a $50,000 reward in the case, and Mangum said the reward may have generated some of these tips. I've been in touch with the family, but we have to be extremely cautious with people because there is a $50,000 reward, Mangum said. I've encouraged the family not to meet with anyone. Let us check the tips out and see what we come up with. I don't want anyone to get hurt. One tip last week led investigators with the Madison County and Oconee County Sheriff's offices to a home on Kevin Way in Hull. While checking out the lead, the deputies ended up charging 3 people with possession of methamphetamine, Madison County Sheriff's Captain Jimmy Patton said. Stephanie Ann Guthrie, 33, of Statham, along with William Craig Lee, 43, and Salvador Chavez Rosales, 30, both of Athens, were arrested on the felony drug charge. A woman who provided the tip that led to the Oglethorpe County well began changing her story, but not to the point that it warranted a charge of giving false information, Mangum said. The well was located at a vacant house that had not been used for many years, Mangum said. Over the years, several people have reported information about Adams, including reports his body was in a barn in Clark County, a report he was killed and the body taken to South Georgia, and one tipster reported that a drug cartel had him killed. In December 2015, Athens Clark police received a report from 2 women reporting to see someone who looked like Adams at 2 businesses on Clayton Street. Police investigated, and a video shows the subject is clearly not the Joshua Adams that is listed as missing from Jackson County, according to the report. His case is being investigated as a homicide. It remains unsolved.
Number 2.
Michael and his sister, Monica, were last seen at Heritage Apartments in the 5700 block of Altama Avenue in Brunswick, Georgia on June 21, 1989. Their mother, Deborah George, and her husband, Robert L. George, were separated, and Michael and Monica were staying with other relatives. Monica with her biological father, and Michael with Robert's first wife and his half-siblings on his father's side. Robert had still been married to his first wife when Michael was born, and Michael did not take his last name. Robert's first wife treated Michael very well and accepted him into the family. Later, Robert divorced his wife and married Deborah, and they had 4 daughters. There are reports that Monica and Michael were helping pack up Robert's apartment in preparation for his upcoming move to Alabama, and that they disappeared after he dropped them off at their mother's residence. However, according to the Bennett children's siblings, Robert's apartment was nearly empty at the time. Monica was very close to her oldest sister, Sheila Wigfall. By 1989, Wigfall was no longer living at home, although she was still in high school at Glen Academy, which Michael and Monica also attended. Wigfall was married, pregnant with her first child and living with her in-laws, but she and Monica spoke to each other every day at school. Early in 1989, Monica had gone to Wigfall at school and said Robert had been sexually abusing her, and she didn't want to go home. Wigfall took her to the school guidance counselor's office, and the guidance counselor took them to the police. When Deborah found out about her daughter's allegations, she told the police she didn't believe them, and thought Monica was just making the stories up because she didn't want to live at home anymore. The matter was dropped without any follow-up from the authorities. Even though years earlier Deborah had walked in on Robert sexually abusing her then 13-year-old sister, and even after one of Monica's sisters caught Robert trying to sneak into her room at night, Deborah refused to believe Robert was abusing Monica. Michael was very close to Robert and didn't believe Monica's allegations either, until late spring. He walked in on Robert molesting his sister. Michael told Deborah what he'd seen, and this is when Deborah and Robert separated. Michael moved in with Robert's first wife, and Monica moved in with her biological father. Little is known about Monica's father, but her family stated she would not have chosen to live with him, except for lack of better options. Robert and Deborah's other children stayed with Deborah and saw their father on weekends. Michael and Monica disappeared weeks after Robert and Deborah's separation. Although he'd just gotten an apartment in Brunswick, Robert decided to move back to his home state of Alabama. By the day of Michael and Monica's disappearance, Robert's apartment was almost entirely packed up, with only some bedding and essentials still unpacked. On the afternoon of June 21, Robert went to his ex-wife's house and told Michael to get in the car with him, so Michael could help him pack. Michael didn't want to go with him and was crying when they left together. Robert then picked Monica up from her father's house, and they went to Robert's apartment complex. The children's aunt also lived at the complex, across the courtyard from Robert's apartment, and Michael and Monica made a surprise visit to her before dark that evening, and had something to eat at her apartment. When she walked them out at about 8:30 p.m., she saw Robert outside. Michael and Monica walked away, and Robert spoke to the children's aunt, and asked her to intercede with Deborah, and get her to let him come home. The aunt called Deborah on a payphone, and then Robert spoke to Deborah on the phone, as Monica and Michael walked up the hill ahead and out of sight. This is the last time anyone besides Robert saw them. Robert later gave two different stories about his son and stepdaughter's disappearances. One was that they ran out of his apartment while he was there and never came back, and the second was that he dropped them off at the apartment and went away to run some errands, and when he returned they were gone. Curiously, the police report about Michael and Monica's disappearance said that Robert called Deborah at 8:30 p.m. to say the children were missing. Robert was speaking to Deborah on the phone at about that time, according to the children's aunt, but Monica and Michael were still within eyesight. According to Michael and Monica's younger sisters, later that evening, Robert picked them up from their mother's home and drove in the streets around John's apartment complex slowly, looking around. He didn't call Michael or Monica's names or ask any passers-by if they'd seen them. He then took the children to his apartment. One of the girls recalled that one of the beds at the apartment was missing its sheets and comforter, and she noticed two trash bags in the apartment by the front door, which Robert said contained Monica and Michael's belongings. Within a few days, Robert's car disappeared. His children never found out what had happened to it. He and Deborah reconciled within a few weeks of Michael and Monica's disappearances, took their remaining children and moved to Alabama on a bus, leaving Wigfall behind in Georgia. Many of Monica and Michael's relatives believe Robert was involved in their disappearances. Deborah's mother described him as a controlling, manipulative and violent husband who occasionally beat Deborah, and Michael and Monica's younger siblings also remember episodes of violent behavior by their father. After the move to Alabama, Deborah would occasionally leave her husband, but would always return to him. Often when she left, she would leave their children behind in his care. Robert's brother has also been mentioned as possibly having been involved in Michael and Monica's cases, or at least knowing what happened to them. He had lived with the family off and on for years, and Robert had also lent him money. Wigfall stated he sexually abused her when she was young, and Deborah had warned the other children to stay away from him. For decades after Michael and Monica disappeared, the police wrote them off as runaways. Both Robert and Deborah said they had run away, and that Monica had a boyfriend who was involved with drugs. The police took reports for their disappearances, but didn't actually investigate until the early 2000s, when the children were reclassified as endangered missing. The Bennett children didn't take any money or belongings when they disappeared, and there's been no record of their existence anywhere in the country since 1989. Foul play is now suspected in Michael and Monica's disappearances.
Number 3.
Pittsburgh native Monica Renee Bowie was a class act. After graduating from high school, she attended Cheney University of Pennsylvania, where she was honored as class valedictorian. Wanting to start a new chapter in her life, Monica moved to Atlanta, but even with the distance, the 34-year-old remained close with her stepfather, mother, and 4 siblings. When she first arrived in the ATL, Monica got a job working as an exotic dancer, but that only lasted for a few months. By 2007, she was working as an accountant for a handful of clients. However, she also was the owner of 2 businesses: an event planning and promotions company, and a clothing boutique. On June 20, 2007, Monica and her fiancé, Shernada Rico Walters, found themselves on the wrong side of the law. The two were facing felony charges following an incident where police searched her vehicle and located a firearm and marijuana. At the time, Walters was driving the vehicle because he was borrowing the car. When questioned by police, Monica was adamant that she was unaware that there was a gun and drugs in her vehicle. She had never been in trouble with the law before, and after an investigation was completed, the charges were dropped against both Monica and Walters. However, Walters was taken into custody because he was on parole after serving 2 years for a drug conviction. The handgun located in Monica's car while he was operating the vehicle was a parole violation. 2 weeks after the couple was arrested on those felony charges, it was the afternoon of July 5, 2007, when Monica had a meeting with her lawyer. According to his accounts, she didn't seem out of sorts and appeared to be acting normally. Later that evening, between 11 p.m. and 11:15 p.m., residents at the Lenox Apartments in Atlanta heard a woman screaming for help in the parking lot. 5 witnesses checked to see what was going on and saw a woman being abducted. The witnesses shared with police that Monica was taken by 2 men described to be in their late 20s or 30s. One of the men was said to be heavy-set with a beard. The vehicle they were traveling in was a maroon-colored 2002 Mercury Sable. One witness on the scene had the wherewithal to write down the license plate before calling the police. Upon arrival, investigators found a number of items in the parking lot. There was jewelry, a manila folder, food items, a pair of eyeglasses, a broken perfume bottle, a woman's green jacket, and 2 broken fingernails. Police were able to locate the vehicle the following day. However, according to the Charlie Project, the car had been burned and set ablaze. 2 days after Monica Renee Bowie was kidnapped, detectives arrested a man named Jasper Keels. He was charged for stealing the Mercury Sable because, during the investigation, police learned that Keels borrowed the vehicle from a friend but never returned it. While he was initially only arrested for theft, 2 months later investigators tacked on the kidnapping charge. Detectives don't know if Keels knew Monica personally, but they do think that her abduction had something to do with drug activity. There have been no arrests in connection with her death, and there have been no leads to indicate where her body may be located. Yet, investigators do believe she is deceased. Walters was in jail at the time of Monica's disappearance, and her family, nor investigators, believed that he was involved in his fiancée's kidnapping. At the time of her disappearance, Monica was 5 foot 4 inches tall and 135 pounds. She has brown eyes and brown hair. She was last seen wearing a dark green dress shirt and blue jeans. She has braces on her teeth, and both of her ears are pierced. Monica would be 46 years old today. Anyone with any information regarding this case is urged to contact the DeKalb County Police Department at 770-724-7715. Please share this story concerning the disappearance of Monica Renee Bowie to help reignite her investigation. She is our sister and her life matters.
Number 4.
Jody resided with her family in Lawrenceville, Georgia in 1994. She departed from their home during the evening hours of May 27, 1994, and planned to drive to her cousin's residence in Pontiac, Michigan. She was traveling alone, driving her black 2-door 1987 Ford Escort, with the Georgia license plate number FRY 137. At 6 p.m. on May 28, Jody called her family and said she thought she was in Erie, Michigan, and that she was lost. It's unclear whether she was actually in Erie or not. She was never seen or heard from again. Jody's vehicle was discovered abandoned and burned along a rural road in Ottawa Lake, Michigan, near Interstate 75, and 2 miles north of Toledo, Ohio, at 7 a.m. on May 29, 1994. Authorities determined the fire had been intentionally set on the front seat of the car. The keys were in the ignition when the fire began, and Jody's suitcases, severely burned, were still inside the car. The driver's seat had been pushed all the way back. Jody drove with the seat pushed forward. There was a dent in the car's back fender that hadn't been there before. There was no sign of Jody at the scene, and an extensive search, with dogs and a helicopter, turned up no sign of her. Jody's home life was somewhat chaotic, as her mother struggled with addiction issues. Jody had dropped out of high school and taken a job at a fast food restaurant. She bought the car with her earnings. Several days before her disappearance, she had driven about 10 pounds of marijuana from Georgia to Michigan with 2 male friends, and was paid a few $100s for doing so. She drove straight from to Michigan and straight back, and as soon as she got home, she began doing laundry and packing for another trip to Michigan, which turned out to be her last. The last trip wasn't a drug run, but was only to visit her relatives. It's unknown whether Jody's involvement with drugs had anything to do with her disappearance. No suspects or persons of interest have ever been named in her case, which remains unsolved.
Number 5.
Kathy was last seen in the company of her boyfriend, Jim Pruitt, on October 2, 1981. They had decided to cancel a fishing trip they'd planned. She allegedly got out of the car near the town square in Dahlonega, Georgia, refused to get back in, and to hitchhike home. She was seen heading south on Highway 19 and 41. Caffey had accused Pruitt of assaulting her earlier in 1981. She said he beat and choked her and shoved her down a flight of stairs at their apartment complex in Marietta, Georgia in July. She told authorities he had beaten her before and once broken her wrist, but she had not reported him before then, because she was afraid. She said Pruitt was trying to get her to drop the charges against him. She disappeared 5 days before his arraignment. At Pruitt's trial for assaulting Caffey, he testified and admitted he'd wrapped his tie around her neck during their argument to scare her, to get her to stop. He was found guilty of misdemeanor battery. Since Caffey disappeared, her credit cards and bank accounts have not been used. She worked as a secretary at a brokerage firm in Atlanta, Georgia in 1981, and her family stated it's uncharacteristic of her to leave without warning. Foul play is suspected in her case, which remains unsolved.
Number 6.
Coates was last seen in Warner Robins, Georgia on April 9, 1988. Her boyfriend, Terrence Eugene Mobley, reported her missing, saying he last saw her at the Houston Mall on North Houston Road. She has never been heard from again. At the time of her disappearance, Coates was a cadet with the Warner Robins Police Department. She left behind a young child. In January 2010, police announced they were satisfied that Coates had been murdered and her body buried. Mobley, who is currently serving a life sentence in prison for another, unrelated murder, told them Coates went to the house in Hawkinsville, Georgia, that she had once shared with him, and was killed in the kitchen. A photo of Mobley is posted with this case summary. He stated his ex-girlfriend committed the actual murder, and he only disposed of the body. When authorities pulled up the kitchen floor of the Hawkinsville home, they found bloodstains which were consistent with Mobley's story of how Coates met her death. He claimed he buried Coates in a wooded area off Industrial Boulevard in Hawkinsville, about 4 miles from where she was killed. Investigators dug in the designated spot for days, but couldn't find any evidence. It had once been a pig farm, and it flooded in 1994. Police believe heavy rains may have washed the remains away. Authorities stated in 2010 that they expected charges to be filed in Coates' presumed homicide. However, no charges have been brought against anyone in connection with her case. Foul play is suspected in her disappearance due to the circumstances involved. Hello 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 hello.